You mentioned the theatre just there, and it's clear from the book that the association between theatre and prostitution is not a myth. It seemed almost like a sort of form of foreplay going to the theatre before the sort of main event.
That's absolutely the case. I mean, back in the Elizabethan period, I was down at the Globe this morning. For instance, Edward Allen, who's a famous actor-manager, his wife was a prostitute and a bawd, which is what they used to call madams, and she was flogged at the cart's arse for procuring girls, for being a prostitute and a madam. And the thing is, that what you have to remember is that the theatre then was not considered respectable. So prostitutes, actors, writers were all more or less on the same footing, so it's inevitable that they consorted with each other. And yes, the theatre was a form of foreplay, because you'd go along and see something tremendously exciting, and then you'd pick up a girl and go up an alley and have sex with her.
I mean, that did strike me as one difference between then and now. The very high degree of visibility of sex and prostitution. I mean, we maybe think of ourselves as having a very sexualized culture, but in the past, people clearly were doing it everywhere. You know, it was hard to avoid it on your morning walk or your evening stroll.
Well, I think that's the case. I mean, people have told me of cultures in other countries. For instance, in France, one of my girlfriends was talking about her boyfriend being mobbed by about a dozen Russian prostitutes when they were just going through a tourist area of Paris, absolutely throwing themselves at him. And that is what it would have been like in 18th century Covent Garden. You know, you would have been walking down the street, minding your own business, off to see your apothecary or to buy a pamphlet. And these girls would have just been throwing themselves, because sooner or later they thought, well, you know, we'll get him, one of us will get him. Part of this was desperation, part of it was just the culture. But what's interesting now is much more goes on behind closed doors. We've had Shirley Porter's clean-up campaign in the 1980s, when all the Soho businesses were forced to have blanked-out windows and no explicit drawings or notices. So it's still bubbling away there, but I don't think it's quite so, to use the phrase, in your face as it would have been in the 18th and 19th century, where you saw them quite clearly.
You mentioned going off to see the apothecary there, and that, I suppose, points up another difference. Although we know we have HIV, AIDS, and sexually transmitted diseases, the stakes in previous centuries were very, very high, both from disease and also in childbirth. You know, you make the point that it was highly risky for a woman to get pregnant. There's an appalling scene where you describe living in the East End in the 19th century and how overpopulated, unsanitary, you say sex was nasty, British and short, because that's the only way it could be.
It was dreadful. It was dreadful for the average working class woman. In fact, marriage, as we understand it in the modern sense, was less common in the lower elements of the working classes, because they simply couldn't afford to get married. It didn't occur to them to get married. But recreational sex was not something that took place between couples in that income bracket, because the husbands were fairly miserable anyway. You know, you had drink to put an end to your worries, but the last thing his wife or partner would want to do was to have sex for fun or a bit of relaxation, because of the dangers of pregnancy. And the few forms of contraception that were available for women in the form of pessaries were so expensive that women at that level didn't have recourse to them, which is why a lot of young girls simply thought, I could have a better life than this, being a prostitute, than I could as a respectable married woman, which is quite shocking in a way.
And you also describe the ravages of syphilis.
Absolutely disgusting disease, for which now fortunately we have antibiotics, but it's only within some people's lifetimes, because antibiotics as a cure for syphilis only became available in the 1940s. For instance, when Harold Nicholson married Vita Sackville-West, he contracted syphilis from a homosexual relationship and had to abstain from any kind of relationship for about 6 months while the treatment was being completed. The most graphic descriptions of syphilis and its effects are really from the 16th century and onwards, where it would attack the mucous membrane, so your nose would fall off or you'd be covered in horrible sores. And of course, another effect of syphilis was it affected you mentally, so you gradually lost your mind. It's believed in some cases that Henry VIII had syphilis, which was the cause of his murderous rages and some insane policy decisions.
And syphilis was also the reason why he wanted to close down brothels. Yes,
in 1548, rather to everybody's surprise, Henry VIII issued an edict saying that all the brothels in London must be closed. And there was concern about this and sort of curiosity, because he was a very libidinous person himself, obviously. Very few boundaries. But what it was that the strain of syphilis had got so out of hand, it was a particularly virulent strain, that people were dying. And the only way to stop it, he thought, would be to close down the brothels. It wasn't entirely successful, of course, but it was a public health menace during his reign and continued to be for centuries afterwards.